The radio crackled with static as Captain Morrison's voice broke through the chaos. "We need immediate extraction. 57 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, zero visibility, roads destroyed by artillery fire." Every rescue attempt has failed. The response from headquarters was swift and brutal. No available pilots. Weather conditions impossible, mission suspended. But in a small motor pool garage 3 miles away, 32-year-old Elena Rodriguez was already grabbing her keys. The other drivers had laughed when she volunteered for the dangerous supply runs. They called her just a truck driver, a woman who shouldn't be handling the big rigs in a war zone. What they didn't know was that Elena had been driving through impossible conditions her entire life. Growing up in the mountains of Peru, navigating treacherous roads during landslides and storms, she had learnt that when everyone else said impossible, it just meant not tried the right way yet. As she fired up the engine of the massive transport truck, Elena had no idea she was about to prove that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room is exactly who you need when everything falls apart. This is the story of how one woman's determination and skill would turn her from an overlooked driver into the hero who saved an entire battalion and changed military history forever. Elena Rodriguez had grown used to the skeptical looks. When she walked into the motor pool at Forward Operating Base Thunder every morning at 0500 hours, the other drivers would pause their conversations and watch her with barely concealed doubt. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 130 pounds, she didn't look like someone who could handle an 18,000-pound military transport truck through hostile territory, but Elena had been proving people wrong her entire life. She had learned to drive when she was 12 years old in the remote mountains of Peru, where her father worked as a supply driver for mining operations. The roads were nothing more than carved ledges on cliff faces, winding through clouds and fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Her father, Carlos, had taught her that driving wasn't about size or strength. It was about understanding the machine, reading the terrain, and never letting fear make your decisions for you. "Mija," he would tell her as they navigated impossible switchbacks in their battered truck, "the road will test you every day. Some days with ice, some days with mud, some days with rocks falling from above. But if you respect the machine and trust your instincts, you can go anywhere anyone else can go. Sometimes places they cannot." Those lessons had served Elena well when she emigrated to the United States at 19. She had worked her way through truck driving school while cleaning offices at night, determined to build a better life for herself and her younger sister Maria, who was still in college. Elena specialized in difficult hauls, oversized loads, hazardous materials, remote locations that other drivers avoided. She earned a reputation for reliability and safety, never missing a delivery date and never having an accident. When military recruiters came to her trucking company looking for experienced drivers willing to deploy overseas, Elena was the first to sign up. The pay was good, and she felt a deep gratitude to the country that had given her opportunities she never could have had at home. But from her first day at the Forward Operating Base, she encountered the same prejudice she had faced her entire career. Sergeant Mike Patterson, a 20-year veteran who supervised the motor pool, had made his feelings clear during Elena's initial briefing. "Look, Rodriguez, I don't know what kind of roads you're used to back in the States, but this isn't like delivering groceries to the mall. Out here, one mistake gets people killed. These trucks cost more than most people make in a decade, and we can't afford to have them broken down because someone couldn't handle the equipment." Elena had simply nodded and said, "I understand, Sergeant. Where would you like me to start?" Patterson had assigned her to the shortest, safest routes, supply runs to nearby checkpoints on well-maintained roads. While other drivers were given the challenging missions to remote outposts, Elena spent her days making routine deliveries that any new recruit could handle. She accepted the assignments without complaint, but inside she burned with frustration. She knew she was capable of more, but she also understood that trust had to be earned. The other drivers weren't deliberately cruel, but their casual dismissal was clear. During mealtime, she would overhear their conversations about the dangerous routes they had navigated, the close calls they had experienced, the split-second decisions that had saved their loads or their lives. When Elena approached, the conversations would shift to safer topics. The weather, news from home, complaints about the food. She was politely excluded from the fraternity of drivers who had proven themselves in the field. Staff Sergeant Jim Collins was the closest thing Elena had to an ally in the motor pool. A quiet man in his 40s from Montana, he had noticed Elena's skill during routine maintenance and safety inspections. Her pre-trip inspections were more thorough than anyone else's. She could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, and had twice prevented breakdowns by catching issues that other drivers had missed. Collins had tried to convince Patterson to give Elena more challenging assignments, but the sergeant remained unconvinced. "She's careful, I'll give you that," Patterson had told Collins. But careful doesn't mean capable. When the shooting starts and you're driving blind through a sandstorm with half a mountain falling down around you, I need drivers who won't freeze up. Rodriguez seems nice enough, but I'm not convinced she's got what it takes when things get ugly. Elena knew about these conversations just as she knew about the pool the drivers had running on when she would ask for a transfer to an easier assignment. They couldn't understand that for someone who had grown up navigating roads where a single mistake meant falling thousands of feet into a canyon, their dangerous routes were simply different, not necessarily worse. The base was located in the mountainous region of Afghanistan, where narrow roads carved into rocky hillsides connected scattered outposts and villages. The terrain reminded Elena of home, except here the dangers included improvised explosive devices, sniper fire, and the possibility of ambush around every curve. Supply convoys traveled in armed groups with military escorts and air support when available. But increasingly as the conflict intensified, resources were stretched thin and drivers often had to rely on their own skills and instincts to complete their missions. Elena watched and learned from every briefing, studied maps of routes she wasn't assigned to drive, and listened carefully to the after-action reports when convoys returned from difficult runs. She memorized the locations of known trouble spots, alternative routes, and emergency procedures. Other drivers seemed to think she was overly nervous, but Elena understood that preparation was the foundation of survival. 3 months into her deployment, Elena finally got her chance to prove herself, though it came in an unexpected way. Staff Sergeant Collins had been assigned a critical supply run to Outpost Sierra, a remote position that had been under intermittent attack for weeks. The outpost was running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The route involved a treacherous mountain road with multiple hairpin turns, loose rock surfaces, and several points where the path was barely wide enough for a large truck. The morning of the mission, Collins came down with severe food poisoning from a bad meal and was clearly in no condition to drive. Patterson was faced with a choice: delay the critical supply run or assign it to another driver. Every other qualified driver was either already on mission or scheduled for mandatory rest periods. Patterson looked around the motor pool, and his eyes settled on Elena, who was performing a routine maintenance inspection on her assigned vehicle. "Rodriguez," Patterson called out, "you're up. Collins is down sick, and Sierra needs these supplies today. Think you can handle it?" Elena looked up from checking the tire pressure on her truck. She had been hoping for this opportunity for months, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of every skeptical look and dismissive comment. If she succeeded, it might open doors to more challenging assignments. If she failed, it would confirm every doubt about her capabilities. "Yes, Sergeant, I can handle it," she replied simply. Patterson briefed her on the route, emphasizing the technical challenges and the importance of the mission. "Sierra has been taking fire almost daily. They're running low on everything. This convoy has to get through, no matter what. You'll have a 2-vehicle escort, but once you're in the mountains, you're basically on your own if something goes wrong. The road is barely wide enough for the truck, and there are several places where backing up isn't an option. You have to commit and keep moving forward." Elena nodded, absorbing every detail. She had studied this route many times during her off hours, tracing the path on maps and talking to drivers who had made the run before. She knew about the loose gravel section at kilometer marker 15, the narrow bridge that couldn't support more than one vehicle at a time, and the steep grade near the end, where trucks had been known to overheat. As Elena prepared her truck for the mission, she noticed the other drivers watching her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some were probably hoping she would succeed, but others seemed to be waiting for confirmation that their doubts had been justified all along. Elena checked and double-checked every system on the massive vehicle, inspected the load securing, and tested the communications equipment. The convoy departed at 0800 hours, with Elena's supply truck sandwiched between 2 armed Humvees. The first part of the route was relatively straightforward, following paved roads through valleys and smaller hills. Elena maintained proper spacing, monitored her radio continuously, and kept her truck positioned exactly where the escort vehicles could provide the best protection. Everything was going according to plan. But as they approached the mountain road that would take them to Outpost Sierra, Elena could see the challenges ahead. The paved road ended abruptly, replaced by a narrow dirt track that had been carved into the side of the mountain decades earlier. The surface was loose gravel and rock, with steep drop-offs on one side and sheer rock walls on the other. This was where her real test would begin. The lead Humvee's radio crackled with an update. "Transport 1. Be advised we have reports of possible hostile activity in Grid Square Charlie 7. That's about halfway up the mountain road. Stay alert and be prepared for evasive action." Elena keyed her radio. Copy that. Understood. She downshifted the massive truck and began the climb, feeling the familiar sensation of the heavy vehicle responding to her commands. The other drivers back at base might see her as just another rookie, but Elena knew that in the next few hours, she would either prove them right or show them what they had been missing all along. The mountain road tested every skill Elena had learned over 15 years of driving. The surface was loose and unpredictable, requiring constant adjustments to maintain traction and control. The turns were so sharp that she had to swing wide into the opposing lane to make them with the long truck, though there was no opposing traffic this far into the wilderness. At several points, the road was so narrow that she could see her outer tires were within inches of the edge, with nothing beyond but a 1,000-foot drop to the valley floor. But Elena felt completely in her element. This was like the mountain roads of her childhood, except with better equipment and clearer visibility. She could feel how the truck wanted to respond to each curve, could sense when the surface was about to change from hard-packed earth to loose gravel. Her breathing was steady, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel, her attention completely focused on the immediate challenges ahead. Behind her, she could hear radio chatter from the escort vehicles. The drivers of the Humvees were clearly nervous about the terrain, discussing alternative routes and contingency plans. But Elena was thinking several moves ahead, planning how to handle the bridge crossing still miles away, calculating fuel consumption and engine temperature for the steep grades yet to come. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Elena began to understand why this route was considered so dangerous. It wasn't just the physical challenges of the road itself, though those were significant. It was the isolation, the feeling of being completely cut off from support, the knowledge that if something went wrong up here, rescue would be hours away at best. But Elena had felt this isolation before, during winter supply runs in Peru, when snow and avalanches could cut off entire regions for weeks. She knew how to function alone, how to solve problems with limited resources, how to keep moving when stopping meant disaster. The radio crackled again. All units, we have movement in the tree line at Grid Square Charlie 7. Possible sniper position. Increase speed and maintain vigilance. Elena pressed slightly harder on the accelerator, pushing the big truck as fast as she dared on the treacherous surface. The engine responded smoothly, testament to her thorough pre-trip inspection and maintenance. She had learned long ago that mechanical problems always occurred at the worst possible moment, and the best prevention was obsessive attention to detail before problems developed. As they approached the area where hostile activity had been reported, Elena found herself thinking about her father's advice. When the road gets dangerous, don't think about the danger. Think about the road. She focused completely on the immediate task of keeping the truck moving safely, trusting her escort to handle any external threats. They passed through the danger area without incident, but Elena remained alert and ready. In her experience, the worst problems usually came not from the expected dangers, but from the unexpected ones that appeared when you thought you were safe. The mountain road was far from over, and she knew that the most challenging sections were still ahead. As they continued climbing toward Outpost Sierra, Elena began to feel the satisfaction of her job being done well. The truck was performing perfectly, the route was proceeding on schedule, and she was proving to herself that her confidence had been justified. But she also knew that in the military, as in civilian trucking, you weren't successful until you had completed the entire mission. And getting to the destination was only half the job. She still had to make it back to base safely. The sun was approaching its zenith as Elena guided her truck around another hairpin turn, the massive vehicle responding to a touch like a well-trained horse. Below them, the valley spread out in a panorama of brown and green, while above them, the road continued its relentless climb toward Outpost Sierra. Elena was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, even if the people back at base didn't understand it yet. The bridge appeared around a sharp curve, like a challenge thrown down by the mountain itself. Elena had studied this crossing on maps and in briefings, but seeing it in person made her breath catch for just a moment. The structure was a relic from decades past, built by Soviet engineers during their occupation, a single lane of weathered concrete and rusted steel spanning a deep gorge. The bridge was barely wide enough for her truck, with no guardrails and a surface that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The lead Humvee had already crossed and was waiting on the far side. Elena could hear the concern in her escort leader's voice over the radio. Transport 1, take your time on this crossing. The surface looks solid, but go slow and steady. We've got you covered on the far side. Elena keyed her microphone. Copy that. Beginning bridge crossing now. She downshifted to the lowest gear and approached the bridge at walking speed, feeling the truck's weight settle onto the ancient concrete. The structure groaned audibly under the load. and she could see hairline cracks in the surface that hadn't been visible from a distance. But Elena had crossed worse bridges in Peru, ancient stone structures that had been built by the Incas and patched countless times over the centuries. She knew that bridges were either strong enough or they weren't. Going fast or slow wouldn't change the fundamental engineering. She maintained steady pressure on the accelerator and kept the truck moving at a constant, careful pace. Halfway across, she felt the bridge sway slightly in the mountain wind. The sensation was unnerving, but Elena forced herself to focus on keeping the truck centered on the narrow roadway. She could see the drop-off on either side, hundreds of feet down to a rocky streambed that would mean instant death for anyone unlucky enough to fall. As she approached the far side of the bridge, Elena felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. This was what she had trained for her entire life, moments when skill and nerve combined to overcome obstacles that stopped other people. She guided the truck onto solid ground and continued up the mountain road without pausing to celebrate. There were still miles to go before reaching Outpost Sierra. The second escort vehicle followed her across the bridge without incident, and the convoy resumed its climb toward the outpost. But as they gained altitude, Elena noticed that the weather was changing. Clouds were building around the mountain peaks, and the wind was picking up. Mountain weather could change rapidly, and Elena knew that conditions that seemed manageable at the start of a journey could become deadly by the end. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the radio operator at Outpost Sierra, shared Elena's surname but no relation, came over the radio with an update. Convoy Alpha 7, be advised weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We have low clouds and increasing wind. Recommend you push hard to reach the outpost before visibility drops further. Elena understood the urgency. Mountain roads were dangerous enough in good weather, but in low visibility they became nearly impassable. She increased her speed as much as she dared, pushing the big truck harder, while still maintaining control on the loose surface. The engine temperature gauge was climbing as they gained altitude, but still within acceptable limits. As they climbed higher, the road became even more challenging. The surface deteriorated from loose gravel to broken rock, and the turns became tighter and more frequent. Elena found herself constantly shifting gears, using the engine brake to control speed on steep descents and downshifting for power on the climbs. The truck responded beautifully to her commands, but she could feel the stress of the mountain road in every component of the vehicle. Then, without warning, the clouds descended around them like a grey curtain. Visibility dropped from several hundred yards to less than 50 feet in a matter of minutes. Elena immediately reduced speed and turned on her headlights, but the fog was so thick that the light seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. The lead Humvee's radio crackled. Transport 1, we can barely see the road ahead. How are you doing back there? Elena checked her mirrors and realized she couldn't see the trailing escort vehicle at all. I've got visual contact with you, but I've lost sight of our rear escort. Recommend we maintain current spacing and keep moving. Stopping here would be more dangerous than continuing. She was drawing on experience from countless fog-shrouded mountain crossings in Peru, where weather could change from clear to impossible in minutes. The key was to keep moving at a safe pace while maintaining contact with your companions. Stopping meant losing momentum and position, which could be fatal on narrow mountain roads. For the next hour, Elena navigated by instinct and memory, using the edge of the road and the white lines when she could see them to maintain position. The truck's diesel engine provided a steady rhythm that helped her judge speed without constantly looking at the speedometer. She could feel every curve and grade through the steering wheel and the seat of her pants, reading the road through the vehicle itself. When the fog finally began to lift, Elena realized they were only a few miles from Outpost Sierra. The escort vehicles reported that all three vehicles were still in formation and on course, but Elena also noticed that her engine temperature gauge was running higher than normal. The combination of high altitude, heavy load, and constant gear changes had pushed the cooling system to its limits. She made a mental note to check the coolant level when they reached the outpost, but for now the engine was still running smoothly. This was exactly the kind of situation where preparation and attention to detail made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Elena had learned to trust her equipment, but also to monitor it constantly for signs of trouble. As they approached the final approach to Outpost Sierra, Elena could see why this position was considered so strategically important. The outpost sat on a commanding hilltop with clear sight lines in all directions, able to monitor movement throughout the valley below. But she could also see why it was so difficult to supply. The road ended in a steep, winding climb that would challenge any vehicle. The final approach was a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside, with grades steep enough that Elena had to downshift to first gear and use every bit of the truck's power to maintain forward progress. The engine strained against the load, but Elena kept it moving steadily upward, never allowing the truck to stall or lose momentum on the steep grade. As they crested the final hill, and Elena saw the outpost ahead, she felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. She had completed her first challenging mission successfully, proving to herself that her skills were equal to the task. But more importantly, she had delivered critical supplies to soldiers who needed them, fulfilling the real purpose of her job. The soldiers at Outpost Sierra greeted the convoy with obvious relief. As Elena backed her truck up to the supply depot, she could see that their situation had been more desperate than she had realized. The outpost was running dangerously low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, even basic maintenance items. Her successful delivery meant the difference between a functioning defensive position and an abandoned outpost. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the outpost commander, approached Elena as she climbed down from the truck cab. "Rodriguez, I heard this was your first run up the mountain. Hell of a job getting through that fog bank. We weren't sure you were going to make it." Elena smiled as she began the process of unloading and inventorying her cargo. "Thank you, Mom. Just doing my job." But as she worked alongside the soldiers to unload critical supplies, Elena knew this mission had been about more than just doing her job. It had been about proving that she belonged among the drivers who took on the most challenging routes. It had been about showing that her skills and determination were equal to any task the military could give her. The return trip to Forward Operating Base Thunder proceeded without incident, though Elena remained alert for new dangers. Mountain roads were unpredictable, and conditions that were manageable on the way up could become treacherous on the way down. But the fog had lifted completely. The truck was running smoothly despite the hard climb, and Elena felt the confidence that came from a successful mission. When they arrived back at base that evening, Elena expected to simply park her truck and file her after-action report. But she found Sergeant Patterson waiting for her in the motor pool, along with Staff Sergeant Collins and several other drivers. The expression on Patterson's face was different from anything she had seen before, a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. "Rodriguez?" Patterson said as Elena shut down her engine. "I heard you had some challenging conditions up there today. How did the truck perform?" Elena climbed down from the cab and began her post-trip inspection, checking fluid levels and looking for any signs of damage or wear. The engine ran hot on the final climb, but within acceptable parameters. "I'll want to check the coolant level and maybe flush the system before the next high-altitude run." Everything else performed perfectly. Patterson nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "Collins, get maintenance to do a complete inspection on Rodriguez's truck tomorrow. I want to make sure that climb didn't stress anything beyond limits." He looked back at Elena. "Good job today, Rodriguez." Captain Walsh called in a personal commendation. "Says you handled those mountain roads like you've been driving them your whole life." Elena felt a warm satisfaction at the recognition, but she also understood that this was just the beginning. One successful mission had opened a door, but she would need to prove herself consistently over time to earn the kind of trust and respect that really mattered. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself assigned to increasingly challenging routes. Her success on the mountain run to Outpost Sierra had demonstrated her capabilities, and Patterson began giving her missions that he had previously reserved for his most experienced drivers. Each assignment was a new test, and Elena approached them with the same careful preparation and focused determination that had served her throughout her career. She delivered fuel to remote checkpoints through sandstorms that reduced visibility to zero. She navigated convoy routes through areas where roadside bombs were a constant threat. She transported ammunition to forward positions under the cover of darkness, driving without lights through terrain that was dangerous enough in daylight. With each successful mission, her reputation grew and her confidence increased. But Elena also understood that reputation in the military was fragile and had to be constantly maintained. One mistake, one moment of poor judgment, and she could find herself back on the safest routes with the newest drivers. She couldn't afford to become overconfident or careless, no matter how many successful missions she completed. The other drivers in the motor pool gradually began to accept her as an equal. Conversations that had once stopped when she approached now included her naturally. Drivers who had completed particularly challenging runs would seek her out to compare notes and share experiences. The casual exclusion that she had experienced during her first months on base was replaced by genuine professional respect. Staff Sergeant Collins became a mentor and friend, sharing his insights from 2 decades of military driving. "The thing about this job," he told Elena one evening as they performed maintenance on their trucks, "is that it's never just about the driving. You're part of a bigger mission, keeping soldiers supplied and supported so they can do their jobs. Every successful run makes everyone safer. Every failure puts people at risk. Elena nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with her job. She had always taken pride in her work, but military driving carried stakes that went far beyond meeting delivery schedules or keeping customers satisfied. Here, failure could mean soldiers going without ammunition in a firefight, or medical supplies not reaching wounded personnel in time to save lives. As autumn turned to winter in the mountainous region, driving conditions became even more challenging. Snow and ice added new dangers to already treacherous routes, and the shorter daylight hours meant that many missions had to be completed in darkness. Elena found herself drawing on childhood memories of winter, driving in Peru, where ice and snow were constant hazards on mountain roads. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated black ice, to maintain control when the truck started to slide on slippery surfaces, and to judge when conditions were too dangerous to continue safely. These were skills that couldn't be taught in a classroom or learned from a manual. They came only from experience and careful attention to the interaction between vehicle, road, and weather. By the time Elena had been on base for 6 months, she had established herself as one of the most reliable and capable drivers in the motor pool. Sergeant Patterson had come to depend on her for the most critical missions, and other drivers sought her advice when facing challenging routes. She had proved that size and gender were irrelevant when it came to handling military vehicles in hostile conditions, but Elena also knew that her biggest test was still ahead. The mission that would define her military career was approaching, though she had no way of knowing it yet. In a few weeks, she would face a situation that would require every skill she had learned over 15 years of driving, every lesson her father had taught her about perseverance and determination, and every bit of courage she could summon. The mission to rescue 57 trapped soldiers would demand everything she had to give, and more than anyone thought she was capable of providing. The emergency briefing came at 0300 hours on a frigid December morning. Elena had been asleep for barely 2 hours when the base alarm sounded, followed by orders for all available drivers to report to the command center immediately. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her mind automatically running through potential scenarios that could require emergency transport at this hour. The command center was buzzing with activity when Elena arrived. Maps covered every available surface. Radio operators were coordinating with multiple remote positions, and senior officers huddled around displays showing weather conditions and enemy activity reports. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, waited until all available drivers had assembled before beginning his briefing. His face was grim, and Elena could see the weight of command in his expression. When he spoke, his words carried the gravity of life and death. "Gentlemen and lady," he began, nodding toward Elena, "we have 57 soldiers trapped at Forward Operating Point Delta, approximately 40 miles north of here in the mountains. They came under heavy attack yesterday evening and had to abandon their vehicles when their convoy was hit by a coordinated ambush. The soldiers managed to reach a defensive position, but they're cut off from any ground rescue route." Colonel Morrison clicked a remote control, and the main display showed aerial photographs of the trapped soldiers' position. The images revealed a small cluster of buildings on a narrow mountain ledge, surrounded by steep terrain and completely isolated from any conventional road network.
"The weather has been working against us," Morrison continued.
"Heavy snow overnight has made helicopter extraction impossible, and the forecast shows conditions getting worse, not better. We have a narrow window, maybe 8 to 10 hours, before a major storm system moves in that could leave these soldiers stranded for days or even weeks." Elena studied the maps and photographs, her experienced eye automatically analyzing the terrain and potential routes. The location was even more remote and challenging than Outpost Sierra, accessible only by a dirt track that wound through some of the most dangerous mountain roads in the region. Under normal conditions, it would be a difficult but manageable drive for an experienced operator. In winter weather, with enemy activity in the area, it would be nearly impossible. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the operations officer, took over the briefing. "We've attempted 2 rescue missions already. The first convoy had to turn back when their lead vehicle became stuck in snowdrifts that blocked the road. The second attempt was aborted when they came under sniper fire and lost their escort vehicle. Both missions confirmed that conventional convoy tactics won't work in these conditions." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand the magnitude of the challenge. This wasn't just another supply run or routine transport mission. This was a rescue operation that had already defeated 2 attempts by experienced teams. The stakes couldn't be higher. 57 soldiers' lives depending on someone finding a way through conditions that had been deemed impossible. Major Robert Hayes, the logistics officer, spread additional maps on the briefing table. The route to Point Delta involves approximately 40 miles of mountain roads, including 3 major passes that are probably blocked by snow. Intelligence reports indicate possible enemy activity at several choke points along the way. Even if we can get through to the soldiers, we still have to bring them back along the same route. Elena leaned forward to study the route map more carefully. The road twisted through terrain that reminded her of the most challenging routes she had driven in Peru, except with the added complications of snow, ice, and hostile forces. But as she traced the path with her finger, she began to see possibilities that others might have missed. "Sir," she said, raising her hand slightly, "what kind of vehicles were used in the previous rescue attempts?" Major Hayes consulted his notes. "Standard convoy configuration. Armed Humvees for escort, personnel carriers for the soldiers, supply trucks for equipment and medical support. Full tactical formation with air cover when available." Elena nodded, her mind working through the tactical implications. "With respect, sir, that might be part of the problem. A full convoy on those mountain roads would be slow, vulnerable, and easy to track. Have you considered using a smaller, more mobile force?" Colonel Morrison looked at Elena with new interest. "What are you thinking, Rodriguez?" Elena pointed to the map, tracing alternative route sections with her finger. These roads were built for local traffic, not military convoys. A large formation would have to stay on the main route, which is predictable and easy to ambush. But a single vehicle, with the right equipment, might be able to use alternate paths that wouldn't support multiple vehicles. "The problem," interjected Captain Mitchell, "is that a single vehicle couldn't carry 57 soldiers. Even our largest personnel carriers only hold about 20 people in field conditions." Elena had anticipated this objection. "What if we made multiple trips? One vehicle, properly equipped and operated, could potentially evacuate the soldiers in 3 or 4 loads. It would take longer, but it might be the only way to succeed where conventional tactics have failed." The room fell silent as the officers considered Elena's proposal. Major Hayes was the first to voice the obvious concern. That would mean sending one driver alone into extremely hostile territory multiple times. The risk to the driver would be enormous. Colonel Morrison studied Elena's face carefully. "Rodriguez, are you volunteering for this mission?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I believe I can get those soldiers out." Sergeant Patterson, who had been silent throughout the briefing, suddenly spoke up. "Sir, Rodriguez is one of our most experienced mountain drivers. She's completed more challenging routes than anyone else in the motor pool. If anyone can make this work, it's her." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Patterson, whose public endorsement carried significant weight with the command staff. But she also understood that volunteering was the easy part. Now she would have to convince experienced military officers to bet 57 lives on her plan. Colonel Morrison turned to his staff officers. "Options and recommendations?" Captain Mitchell spoke first. "The weather window is closing rapidly. We need to make a decision within the next hour if we're going to attempt any kind of rescue before the storm hits. Waiting means those soldiers could be trapped for an extended period." Major Hayes consulted weather reports on his tablet. Current conditions show the road might be passable for the next 6 to 8 hours. After that, snow accumulation will make travel impossible until the storm passes, which could be 3 to 5 days.
What about enemy activity? Morrison asked.
Captain Mitchell updated them on the latest intelligence. "We have reports of small enemy units in the area, probably the same group that ambushed the original convoy. They're likely monitoring the main approaches to Point Delta, but they probably don't have the resources to watch every possible route." Elena seized the opportunity to elaborate on her plan. "Sir, I've been studying the topographical maps. There's an old mining road that parallels the main route but stays about 2 miles to the east. It's not shown on most military maps because it was abandoned years ago, but satellite imagery suggests it's still passable. A single vehicle might be able to use that route to approach Point Delta without being detected." Colonel Morrison examined the map Elena indicated. "How do you know about this road?" "I grew up in similar terrain in Peru, sir. Mining roads were often our only way to reach remote locations. They're usually built to handle heavy equipment, so they're more durable than they appear. The fact that this one isn't on current maps might actually be an advantage. The enemy wouldn't expect it to be used." Major Hayes raised another concern. "Even if the route is viable, we're still talking about a massive logistical challenge. Rodriguez would need to make multiple trips through hostile territory in deteriorating weather, carrying soldiers who might be wounded or suffering from exposure." Elena had thought through these issues during the briefing. "Sir, I recommend using our largest cargo truck, modified with heating systems and medical supplies. It won't be comfortable, but it could carry 20 soldiers per trip, maybe more if necessary. With proper planning, I could complete the evacuation in 3 round trips. The room erupted in discussion as officers debated the risks and benefits of Elena's proposal. Some argued that sending one driver alone was too dangerous, while others pointed out that conventional approaches had already failed. The clock was ticking, and with each passing minute, the weather conditions were deteriorating. Finally, Colonel Morrison called for silence. "Rodriguez, I need you to understand exactly what you're volunteering for. You would be driving alone into hostile territory on roads that may or may not be passable, in weather conditions that are getting worse by the hour. If something goes wrong, we might not be able to rescue you. Are you absolutely certain you want to take this mission?" Elena thought about the 57 soldiers trapped on the mountain, probably cold, possibly wounded, and definitely counting on someone to get them out. She thought about her father's lessons about perseverance and determination, about the responsibility that came with specialized skills, and about the oath she had taken when she joined the military. "Yes, sir, I'm certain." Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. "Very well. Major Hayes, prepare our largest transport vehicle with maximum cold weather and medical equipment. Captain Mitchell, coordinate intelligence updates and communication protocols. I want Rodriguez to have every possible advantage." As the officers dispersed to prepare for the mission, Elena felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that came before every challenging drive. But this time, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't about proving herself to skeptical colleagues or establishing her reputation. This was about bringing 57 soldiers home safely. Sergeant Patterson approached Elena as she studied the maps one final time. "Rodriguez, I want you to know that I was wrong about you when you first arrived. You've proved yourself to be one of the finest drivers I've ever worked with. But this mission, this is different. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Elena looked up from the maps and smiled. "Sergeant, my father used to tell me that the road will test you differently every day. Today, it's testing whether I'm brave enough to drive it when others need me to. I think I'm ready for that test." As dawn broke over forward operating base Thunder, Elena completed her final preparations. The massive transport truck had been equipped with additional heating systems, medical supplies, extra fuel, and emergency equipment. The vehicle was as ready as military mechanics could make it, but Elena knew that the success of the mission would ultimately depend on her skills, her judgment, and her determination to bring every soldier home safely. The weather was holding for now, but meteorologists confirmed that conditions would deteriorate rapidly throughout the day. Elena had perhaps 8 hours of marginally acceptable driving conditions, and she needed to use every minute wisely. The trapped soldiers were counting on her, their families were counting on her, and the entire base was counting on her. As Elena climbed into the cab of her truck and fired up the powerful diesel engine, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. But she also felt the confidence that came from years of preparation for exactly this kind of challenge. The mountain roads ahead would test every skill she had learned, but Elena Rodriguez was ready to prove that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly who you need when everything falls apart. The radio crackled with final mission updates as Elena prepared to depart. Weather conditions at Point Delta were deteriorating, enemy activity reports were inconclusive, and the condition of the trapped soldiers remained unknown. But none of that changed Elena's determination. She had volunteered for this mission, and she would complete it successfully or die trying. As she guided the massive truck toward the base exit, Elena thought about the mining roads of her childhood, about her father's lessons on perseverance, and about the 57 soldiers who were depending on her courage and skill. The next 12 hours would define her military career and possibly save dozens of lives. Elena Rodriguez was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line. The first 20 miles passed without major incident, but Elena could feel the weather deteriorating around her. What had started as light snow was becoming heavier, and the wind was picking up significantly. She maintained radio contact with base every 15 minutes, reporting her position and conditions, but as she climbed higher into the mountains, the radio signals began to fade. Elena found the entrance to the old mining road exactly where the satellite imagery had indicated it would be. The turnoff was almost invisible, marked only by 2 weathered wooden posts and barely wide enough for her massive truck. But as she eased the vehicle onto the abandoned track, Elena felt a surge of confidence. The road surface was rough but solid, built to handle heavy mining equipment decades ago, and still structurally sound despite years of neglect. The mining road offered both advantages and challenges compared to the main route. It was certainly more concealed, winding through dense forest and following natural contours that would make the truck difficult to spot from a distance. But it was also narrower and more winding, with steep grades and tight turns that tested Elena's driving skills at every mile. As she navigated a particularly sharp switchback, Elena's radio crackled with weak signals from base. Transport 1, can you position report? The transmission was breaking up badly due to the terrain and weather conditions. Elena tried to respond but got only static. She was now truly on her own, cut off from support and guidance, relying entirely on her own skills and judgment. The isolation was both frightening and liberating. She could focus completely on the immediate challenges of driving without worrying about radio protocols or coordinating with other units. The truck's heating system was working overtime to keep the cab warm, but Elena could see ice beginning to form on her side mirrors and windshield. The mountain temperature was dropping rapidly as altitude increased, and the snow was beginning to accumulate on the road surface. She adjusted her driving accordingly, reducing speed and increasing following distance behind her own headlight beams. After 3 hours of careful driving, Elena reached the highest point on the mining road, where it connected with a ridgeline that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Under normal circumstances, she might have paused to appreciate the scenery, but today, the view was dominated by the approaching storm system. Dark clouds were building rapidly, and Elena could see snow squalls moving across the peaks ahead of her. The descent from the ridgeline toward Point Delta was the most technically challenging part of the route. The road dropped more than 2,000 feet in elevation over just 5 miles, with grades steep enough that Elena had to use the engine brake continuously to maintain control. The surface was increasingly icy, and she could feel the massive truck wanting to slide despite its weight and traction systems. Elena's experience on mountain roads served her well during this descent. She knew to keep the truck in low gear, to avoid sudden steering inputs that could break traction, and to maintain steady pressure on the brakes rather than pumping them. The truck responded to her commands like a well-trained partner, its systems working together to maintain control, even in difficult conditions. As she approached the valley floor where Point Delta was located, Elena caught her first glimpse of the trapped soldiers' position. The defensive position was even more isolated than the photographs had suggested, perched on a narrow ledge with steep terrain on all sides. She could see why helicopter extraction had been impossible. There was simply no safe landing zone within miles of the position. The final approach to Point Delta required Elena to navigate a series of hairpin turns carved into the mountainside. The road had clearly been built for lighter vehicles, and Elena had to swing wide into the opposing lane on every turn to accommodate her truck's length. The surface was covered with several inches of snow, and she could feel the tires searching for traction on the icy substrate underneath. When Elena finally reached the perimeter of Point Delta, she was greeted by soldiers who looked like they couldn't believe their eyes. A massive military truck had just appeared on a road that everyone assumed was impassable, driven by a small woman who looked completely calm, despite having just completed one of the most challenging drives in military history. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, the ranking officer among the trapped soldiers, approached Elena's truck as she shut down the engine. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got up here, but you just saved 57 lives. We were beginning to think nobody was coming." Elena climbed down from the cab and assessed the situation quickly. The soldiers were cold and exhausted, but appeared to be in relatively good condition considering their circumstances. Several had minor injuries from the original ambush, but nothing that would prevent them from traveling. The bigger concern was hypothermia. They had been exposed to freezing temperatures for more than 20 hours. "Lieutenant, I can take 20 soldiers on this trip, maybe 22 if some are willing to stand. We need to get the most seriously injured out first, along with anyone showing signs of severe cold exposure." Thompson nodded and began organizing his men. "Rodriguez, right? We heard your transmission before we lost radio contact. How many trips are you planning to make?" Elena was already calculating loads and timing in her head. 3 trips should do it. But we need to move fast. The weather is deteriorating rapidly, and I want to get everyone out before conditions become impossible." As the soldiers loaded onto her truck, Elena couldn't help but notice their expressions. These were experienced combat veterans who had seen their share of dangerous situations, but they looked at her with something approaching awe. She had accomplished something that 2 previous rescue attempts had failed to achieve, driving through conditions that had been deemed impassable. The first return trip tested Elena's skills even more severely than the approach had. The truck was now carrying 20 soldiers plus their equipment, adding significant weight that affected braking and handling. The snow was falling more heavily, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some areas, and Elena was driving on increasingly icy roads where a single mistake could send the overloaded truck sliding off the mountain. But Elena felt completely in control. The truck responded predictably to her commands. The soldiers were quiet and cooperative, and she was successfully executing a plan that she had designed herself. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire career, even if she hadn't known it at the time. The return journey took nearly 4 hours due to the deteriorating conditions, but Elena delivered her first load of soldiers safely to Forward Operating Base Thunder. As she backed the truck up to the medical station, she could see the relief and excitement on the faces of the base personnel. Word of her successful mission was already spreading, and everyone wanted to see the driver who had achieved the impossible. But Elena had no time for celebration. Weather reports indicated the conditions were worsening rapidly, and she needed to complete 2 more trips before the storm made travel impossible. She refueled the truck, checked all systems, and loaded additional cold weather gear for the remaining soldiers. The second trip to Point Delta was significantly more challenging than the first. Snow accumulation had increased the depth on the roads by several inches, and wind was creating drifts in exposed areas. Elena had to use 4-wheel drive for most of the journey, and there were several points where she wasn't certain the truck would maintain traction on steep grades. The mining road that had been her secret weapon on the first trip was becoming increasingly treacherous. Snow had filled in the ruts and depressions that helped define the roadway, making it difficult to determine exactly where the safe driving surface ended and dangerous drop-offs began. Elena found herself driving as much by intuition as by sight, feeling her way through turns and grade changes. When she reached Point Delta for the second time, Elena could see the conditions at the isolated position had deteriorated significantly. The remaining soldiers were showing signs of serious cold exposure, and several were displaying symptoms of mild hypothermia. Lieutenant Thompson met her with obvious concern. "Rodriguez, I don't think we should risk a third trip. Take the worst cases now and we'll try to hold out until the weather improves." Elena looked at the exhausted soldiers and made a quick decision. "Negative, Lieutenant. I'm not leaving anyone on this mountain. Load 21 men this time. We'll make it work." The second return trip pushed both Elena and her truck to their absolute limits. The vehicle was now severely overloaded, carrying 21 soldiers plus equipment in a truck designed for 20 passengers maximum. The extra weight made every hill climb a struggle and every descent a white-knuckle experience. Elena had to use every technique she had learned over 15 years of mountain driving to maintain control. But the most serious challenge was visibility. The storm had intensified to near blizzard conditions, with snow falling so heavily that Elena's headlights seemed to create more glare than illumination. She was forced to drive at walking speed through many sections, navigating as much by memory and instinct as by sight. At one point, Elena realized she had lost the road entirely. The truck was still moving forward on what seemed like solid ground, but she couldn't see any of the landmarks that had guided her on previous trips. She stopped the vehicle and climbed out into the blinding snow to assess their position on foot. After several minutes of careful exploration, Elena discovered that they had drifted onto a side path that led nowhere. She would have to back the overloaded truck several hundred yards through the snow to regain the main track, a maneuver that would challenge even the most experienced driver under these conditions. Elena took her time, using every mirror and backing technique she had learned, inching the massive vehicle backward through deepening snow, while 21 soldiers sat quietly and trusted her judgment. When she finally felt the truck's wheels find the familiar ruts of the main track, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction before continuing the journey. The approach to base took more than 5 hours, but Elena delivered her second load of soldiers safely. She had now rescued 41 of the 57 trapped men, but conditions had deteriorated to the point where many believed a third trip would be impossible. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, and meteorologists were predicting that roads would be completely impassable within a few hours. Colonel Morrison met Elena at the motor pool as she prepared for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous trip of all. "Rodriguez, you've already accomplished more than anyone thought possible. We can't ask you to risk your life for one more trip when conditions are this bad." Elena looked at the colonel with steady determination. "Sir, there are 16 soldiers still on that mountain. I didn't come this far to leave them behind. I can make one more trip if I leave immediately." As Elena climbed back into her truck for the final journey, she knew she was attempting something that was probably impossible. The storm was at its worst, visibility was near zero, and the roads were buried under snow that might be too deep for even her heavy truck to navigate. But 16 soldiers were counting on her, and Elena Rodriguez had never left a job unfinished. The third trip to Point Delta would test every skill Elena had ever learned, and demand courage beyond anything she had previously displayed. But as she guided her truck into the blinding storm, she felt the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The mountain would test her one final time, but Elena was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm had transformed the mountain landscape into an alien world of swirling white chaos. Elena could barely see the hood of her truck through the windshield, despite the wipers working at maximum speed and the defrost system running full blast. Snow was accumulating faster than her vehicle could push through it, and she was forced to stop several times to clear ice from her side mirrors and headlights. The mining road that had been her salvation on the first 2 trips was now barely passable. Snow had drifted to depths that reached the truck's bumper in places, and Elena found herself breaking trail through virgin snow where no vehicle had ever traveled. The truck's 4-wheel drive system was working constantly, and she could hear the engine straining against the load and conditions, but Elena refused to turn back. 16 soldiers were still trapped on Point Delta, including several who were showing serious signs of hypothermia when she had left them. Every hour of delay increased the risk that some of the remaining men might not survive the exposure. She had come too far and accomplished too much to abandon the mission when it was almost complete. Navigation had become almost entirely by instinct. The GPS system was useless in the storm, and all the landmarks Elena had memorized were invisible in the blowing snow. She was navigating by feel. The way the truck responded to changes in grade, the sound of the wind around different terrain features, the subtle variations in how the tires gripped the surface. These were skills that couldn't be taught in any school, learned only through years of experience on dangerous roads. At several points, Eleanor wasn't certain she was still on any road at all. The truck seemed to be moving through open forest, pushing between trees, and over terrain that felt more like wilderness than any constructed path. But each time she began to doubt her direction, she would encounter a familiar curve or grade that confirmed she was still on the right track. The climb to the ridgeline that marked the halfway point of her journey seemed to take forever. The truck was moving at walking speed through snow that was now knee-deep in places, with the engine working at maximum power just to maintain forward progress. Elena could feel the vehicle struggling against the conditions, but the mechanical systems were holding up perfectly, thanks to her thorough maintenance and preparation. When she finally crested the ridge, Elena faced a terrifying realization. The descent to Point Delta, which had been challenging under normal conditions, now looked absolutely impossible. The road was buried under several feet of drifted snow, and the steep grade that had required careful control in clear weather now appeared completely impassable. For the first time during the entire mission, Elena allowed herself to consider the possibility of failure. Perhaps the colonel had been right. Perhaps 3 trips were simply not possible under these conditions. Perhaps she should turn back now while she still could, accepting that 41 rescued soldiers was better than risking her own life in an impossible attempt to save 16 more. But as she sat in the truck cab contemplating her options, Elena thought about Lieutenant Thompson and the 15 remaining soldiers who were counting on her return. She thought about her father's lessons about perseverance, about never giving up when others were depending on you. She thought about the oath she had taken when she joined the military, and about the responsibility that came with being the only person capable of completing this mission. Elena engaged the truck's lowest gear and began the descent toward Point Delta. The vehicle moved forward at less than walking speed. But it moved forward. The snow was so deep that it pushed up over the hood and broke against the windshield like ocean waves. But the truck's momentum and weight carried it through. Elena couldn't see where she was going, but she could feel the familiar rhythm of the turns and grades she had memorized on previous trips. The descent became a battle between Elena's determination and the mountain's defenses. At one point, the truck became completely stuck in a snowdrift that reached nearly to the cab windows. Elena spent 20 minutes digging with an emergency shovel, clearing snow from the wheels and undercarriage, before the vehicle could move forward again. Her hands were numb with cold despite her gloves, and she was exhausted from the physical effort, but she refused to quit. When Elena finally reached Point Delta for the 3rd time, she found the remaining soldiers huddled around a small fire, using equipment and fuel from abandoned vehicles to maintain warmth. Several men were showing serious signs of hypothermia, and Lieutenant Thompson met her with desperate relief. "I can't believe you made it back," Thompson said as Elena climbed stiffly from her truck. "We thought you might have to turn back. Conditions up here have gotten worse every hour." Elena assessed the situation quickly. The remaining 16 soldiers were in worse condition than the men from her previous trips, with several requiring immediate medical attention and all showing signs of prolonged cold exposure. Loading them safely would require extra time and care that she wasn't sure she had. "Lieutenant, we need to get everyone loaded immediately. The storm is still intensifying, and if we don't leave in the next few minutes, we might not be able to get out at all." The loading process was complicated by the soldiers' condition and the extreme weather. Elena had to help several men who were too weak from cold exposure to climb into the truck under their own power. She used sleeping bags and emergency blankets to create additional insulation in the cargo area, trying to provide maximum warmth for men who had been exposed to freezing temperatures for more than 30 hours. As the last soldier was loaded onto her truck, Elena realized she was facing the most dangerous part of the entire mission. She was now carrying 16 soldiers who were in poor condition, driving through the worst weather she had ever encountered, on roads that might no longer be passable even for a heavy vehicle. If something went wrong during this return trip, it could mean disaster for everyone aboard. But Elena also felt a profound sense of purpose and determination. She had volunteered for this mission, had planned and executed it successfully through 2 incredibly dangerous trips, and was now just hours away from completing what everyone had said was impossible. 57 soldiers would go home to their families because she had refused to accept that the mission couldn't be accomplished. The return journey began as a slow-motion nightmare. Visibility was essentially zero. Snow was falling faster than Elena had ever seen, and the truck was moving through drifts that threatened to stop forward progress entirely. Elena found herself driving by touch and intuition, feeling her way along a route that existed more in her memory than in any visible reality. The climb back to the ridgeline took more than 2 hours. Elena had to stop repeatedly to clear snow from the truck's air intake and radiator, preventing the engine from overheating despite the frigid conditions. The soldiers in the back were quiet, understanding that their driver was performing a miracle of skill and determination just to keep them moving forward. At the ridgeline, Elena faced her greatest challenge yet. The mining road that had brought her to Point Delta was now completely obliterated by blowing snow. She could see no trace of the path she had followed on the way up, and several possible routes led off into the wilderness. Choosing the wrong direction could mean becoming lost in a blizzard with 16 lives depending on her judgment. Elena stopped the truck and climbed out into the howling wind to assess her options on foot. The cold was so intense that it took her breath away, and the wind was strong enough to knock her off balance. But she forced herself to study the terrain carefully, looking for subtle clues that might indicate the correct route. After several minutes of careful observation, Elena noticed a depression in the snow that seemed to follow a consistent contour line. It was barely visible, but it appeared to match her memory of the mining road's general direction. She climbed back into the truck, said a brief prayer, and committed to following that faint trace through the wilderness. For the next 3 hours, Elena navigated through some of the most challenging driving conditions imaginable. The truck moved through snowdrifts that reached halfway up the doors, crossed frozen streams where she couldn't tell if the ice would support the vehicle's weight, and climbed grades so steep that she wasn't certain they would reach the top. But gradually, Elena began to recognize familiar landmarks. A distinctive rock formation appeared through the snow, followed by a curve that matched her memory of the route. The truck was still moving, the engine was still running smoothly, and she was successfully following the path that would take them home. The final descent toward Forward Operating Base Thunder felt like emerging from a nightmare into salvation. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, and Elena could see the lights of the base appearing through the snow ahead. She had done it, completed 3 trips through impossible conditions, and brought all 57 soldiers home safely. As Elena backed her truck up to the medical station for the final time, she was greeted by what seemed like the entire base personnel. Word of her mission had spread throughout the installation, and everyone wanted to see the driver who had accomplished the impossible. Colonel Morrison was waiting with medics and hot coffee, his face showing a mixture of relief and amazement. "Rodriguez," the colonel said as Elena climbed down from her truck for the last time, "I've been in the military for 25 years, and I have never seen anything like what you just accomplished. 57 soldiers are alive today because of your courage and skill." Elena helped the medics unload the final group of soldiers, making sure each man received immediate attention for cold exposure and exhaustion. Only when the last soldier had been taken to the warm medical facility did she allow herself to fully comprehend what she had achieved. Over the following days, as the storm cleared and normal operations resumed, the full scope of Elena's accomplishment became apparent. Military analysts studying her route and timing concluded that she had completed a mission that should have been impossible under the prevailing conditions. The combination of severe weather, hostile territory, and technical challenges had created a situation that defeated conventional military tactics, but Elena's unique skills and determination had found a way through. The Army awarded Elena the Silver Star for her actions during the rescue mission, one of the highest decorations for valor that can be earned by a non-combat soldier. The citation read, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action while serving as a vehicle operator during a combat rescue mission. Specialist Rodriguez voluntarily undertook an extremely hazardous mission to rescue 57 soldiers trapped in hostile territory during severe weather conditions. Through exceptional driving skill, personal courage, and unwavering determination, she successfully completed 3 dangerous trips through impassable terrain, bringing all trapped personnel to safety. But Elena understood that the real recognition came from the soldiers she had rescued and their families. Over the months that followed, she received letters from wives, children, and parents thanking her for bringing their loved ones home. Those letters meant more to her than any medal or official recognition ever could. The mission also changed Elena's career trajectory completely. She was promoted to staff sergeant and became the lead instructor for the Army's mountain driving school, teaching other drivers the skills and techniques she had learned through years of experience on dangerous roads. Her story became required reading for military logistics personnel, and her techniques were incorporated into official training manuals. But perhaps the most important change was in how Elena viewed herself and her abilities. She had always known she was a skilled driver, but the mission to rescue 57 soldiers had proved that her capabilities extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, including herself. She had faced the ultimate test of her skills, courage, and determination, and had emerged successful. Years later, when Elena had retired from military service and returned to civilian life, people would sometimes ask her about the mission that made her famous. How had she found the courage to attempt something that everyone said was impossible? How had she maintained control of a massive truck through conditions that had defeated multiple previous attempts? Elena's answer was always the same. My father taught me that the road will test you differently every day. Sometimes it tests your skill, sometimes your courage, sometimes your determination to keep going when everything seems hopeless. But if you respect the road, trust your training, and never give up on the people counting on you, you can accomplish things that seem impossible. The little girl who had learned to drive on dangerous mountain roads in Peru had grown up to become a hero, proving that sometimes the most underestimated person is exactly who you need when everything falls apart. Elena Rodriguez had saved 57 lives by refusing to accept that a mission was impossible, and in doing so, she had changed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who heard her story. The mountain roads of Afghanistan had tested Elena Rodriguez in ways she had never imagined, but she had passed every test, and in proving that one determined person could accomplish the impossible, she had inspired countless others to believe that they too might be capable of more than they had ever dared to imagine. The driver they had underestimated had become the hero who saved an entire battalion, and her story would be remembered long after the storms had passed and the roads had been rebuilt.